I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of the Top 10 of the 2010s. And this week we're going to be starting once again another list, but we're winding down the series. This is going to be the second last list where I really break it down before we jump back into the old Oscar countdown series, the flagship series where I break down the Oscars and give my predictions. Normally it would start during this time, and normally this episode would actually be the beginning of the old Oscar countdown series, but due to the Oscars delaying by 2 months, I decided to delay my progress and my coverage of them by 2 months so that it's not a sort of 8-month journey. That just sort of shortens it down a little bit to make it a little bit easier and to make my predictions a little bit more accurate. But that's not to say I'm not having fun with the show. I'm having a terrific time breaking down these lists and once again starting a new list being the top 10 biopics of the decade. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is talk about some of my favorite movies of the decade. Essentially how it works is that every 3 weeks I start a new list, and within those 3 weeks I break down said list. With the first video being my honorable mentions and my picks from 10 to 7, the next week my picks from 6 to 2, and then finally my number one favorite action movie of the decade, romance movie of the decade, where I give a whole video explaining why I like that movie so much and I think it is the best of said genre. But the last couple lists that we're going to be looking at is this one, which is going to be the top 10 biopics, and then 3 weeks from now we're going to be looking at the top 10 best picture winners, and then finally just one video instead of 3 of my top 10 movies of the decade, the final cumulative list, before we once again jump into the old Oscar countdown. But this is always a long video because I have my 5 honorable mentions, including my 10 to 7 picks, and I love to talk about these movies just because it really is almost in a way a top 15, except I don't rank those honorable mentions. But without further ado, if you're new, also that there's timestamps in the description so you can jump around to see which movies you want to check out. But before we get into anything, I do want to mention what I consider a biopic is, sort of the definition, that there is a little bit of a distinction I make between a biopic and a based on true story movie. Now, if we take a movie like American Hustle, that's a movie that has sort of a lot of ensemble pieces and is based on a true story. However, I would consider that a biopic. For the most part, my definition of a biopic has to revolve around 1 or 2 people, and that the plot, the mechanics, the sort of whole movie is centered around these 2 people or this one person and their sort of journey. It always has to be a real life person. It can't be sort of an amalgamation with something like Patriots Day. It does have to be a real life person. And for the most part, especially on this list, it usually just is one person that we're going to sort of look at. They've been becoming more popular as of recent because they can get Oscar chances, but also they has that sort of built-in IP that a lot of people will see a movie about Queen or about Freddie Mercury because they really like the band. So without out of the way, just give an example. I, Tonya is a movie that could have qualified for this list because it is about Tonya Harding, but like I said, something like American Hustle or Spotlight are more what I would consider in the based on a true story genre. It's also notable that these people don't have to be famous, that they can just be regular people, but if it is just a singular person, and maybe they're not that famous, or maybe they had some sort of cultural impact clearly enough to make a story about them, but still they don't necessarily have to be the most celebrated person of the decade, for example. They can really be just sort of these small insular people that I had not even heard about till I saw the movie. But with that out of the way, let's just jump into my honorable mention, my first one being Big Eyes. An unconventional movie from the legendary stylist director Tim Burton, but still a movie I like. It's an unconventional movie from Tim Burton standards because he is known for being very visually stylistic, that his view and lens on the world is different and it's surreal and it's a heightened kind of reality. So in the beginning you have movies like Beetlejuice and Batman, even something like Ed Wood in that same respect. But then more recently, I feel like sometimes when he does try to do the Tim Burton element, it's not necessarily uniquely his, it's more like what other people think Tim Burton is, or this hot topic kind of amalgamation that he started, but is now morphed into something a little bit different. So as a matter of fact, in his sort of late stage period films, I actually enjoy movies like Big Eyes, which just rely on the character, which rely on the story, and really show the audience that he can still tell a really great, moving, empathetic story without being sort of bogged down by all these visual stylistic stuff and all the CGI and all this sort of stuff that he's done in his later part. He doesn't necessarily need to still tell an effective story. And I think a large part why this film also succeeds is because of Amy Adams. I'm a huge Amy Adams fan. I think she's really terrific here as Margaret Margaret Keane. And the story is about this woman named Margaret Keane who would paint these pictures of these little girls with big eyes. And her husband said that it would be easier to sell, and sort of took over credit for the work and sold it himself. And so it created this sort of abusive relationship between husband and wife, where Margaret was painting all the pictures, but her husband was taking all of the credit and profiting off that. The movie is more in line with like a Big Fish in terms of its humanist goal, but Burton correctly sort of sees Amy Adams as the star of this movie and really focuses in on her. That so much of it is her perspective, her relationship of trying to balance this abusive relationship, that she's able to recognize that this isn't bad, but it's not necessarily easy to do, easy to get out of the relationship. So a lot of the movie is sort of getting tricked into this kind of a partnership, and then realizing the sort of abuse that's going on, sort of mental and physical abuse that's going on within the relationship. And Amy's able to sort of communicate through Margaret's sort of shy demeanor, that she is sort of a shy kind of a person. Amy's still able to communicate her frustration, still able to communicate Margaret's clear talent, her vision, but also her fear, that fear for her kids, fear for her own life, because of sort of how the relationship evolves and how the power dynamics are so skewed. And Amy's able to really communicate that to us through this sort of shy veneer, and really create an incredibly empathetic and sympathetic portrait of this woman that you really feel emotional by the end of it, and really invested into her struggle, into her journey. And that really is thanks to Amy Adams and really Burton's ability to add some elements of surrealism to it, but for the most part sort of having this realistic, grounded kind of a movie, which adds to the sort of domestic issues and really heightens the believability of this sort of story. Then my next pick is going to be Love and Mercy, a movie in two parts about Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, one in his 60s while he's making the infamous, one of the greatest albums of all time, Pet Sounds, and then in the second half we see Brian Wilson older in the 80s when he's being manipulated by his psychiatrist. Now, this is a movie in two parts, and I personally like a lot of movies that are in two parts because it's very easy to show sort of parallels between the two, and you can intercut and crosscut and sort of play with time. That I think is really advantageous to the medium of film. The one part is played by Paul Dano as Brian Wilson in sort of the 60s part, where it's really interested in visualizing the creative process and sort of helping us to understand the genius of Brian Wilson, that he has sort of come from a lot of trauma and sort of a father who is almost impossible to please, and someone who has sort of really struggles with that. But in the first half, we see Brian really take that kind of criticism and trauma and put that into his music and sort of funnel that into this experimental part. And the movie is also very interested in the experimentation, that so much of the movie is visualizing how an artist creates these songs and how much trial and error comes to it, and how he can sort of move that sort of trauma into his past and direct it into the music. But then in the second half with John Cusack in the 80s, it shows how easily manipulative that can be when Brian Wilson doesn't have the music outlet, when his sort of mind is out of control, and how almost sickening it can be for him. Not only manipulative and, it can be sort of swayed one way, but also how it really destroys his life and how he's not able to produce music from them. Personally, I like the 60s part just hanging out there. I think Paul Dano is also able to more accurately capture the innocence of someone like Brian, but also still the genius. And the film is really able to capture just that music-making process and the creative process better than I think most films that I've personally ever seen. And the John Cusack part with Paul Giamatti is good and interesting and provides a good sort of mirror and duality between the two timelines. But it's a little bit more scatterbrained in that sense, which is maybe why it's leaving it off the list. But the stuff that's great in here is really terrific. And I think if you're a Beach Boys fan, or even not, and you want to learn more about the Beach Boys, because they're one of the greatest sort of bands of all time, I think you'll definitely appreciate and learn more about Brian Wilson and his sort of genius here in this movie, Love and Mercy. Then I'm going to talk about First Man. This is a movie from director Damien Chazelle, who's had one of the hottest sort of beginnings to a director's career in recent memory. comes out with Whiplash and gets nominated for a bunch of Oscars, wins 3, and is like, wow, this is the new hot young director. Then he follows up with La La Land, which had won 6 Oscars, almost won Best Picture, did for about a minute and a half, and then 2 years later, we get another Damien Chazelle vehicle, First Man, and it's a movie about Neil Armstrong, and it's a space movie, and it's a biopic, and oh my god, this is going to be such a great Oscars movie. And I think it sort of got stigma and pigeonholed into being that. And while I don't think it's necessarily as good as something like La La Land or even as Whiplash, it's still a great movie. And if this were a movie in any other director's filmography, I think it would have definitely been respected and appreciated. So taking the movie sort of out of its context at the time and just looking at it as a movie itself, it's really terrific. It's about Neil Armstrong, the first man to land on the moon, which is a name and somebody everyone knows about, but really doesn't know anything aside from that. They know Neil Armstrong, he landed on the moon, and that's it. They don't know anything else about his sort of personal inner life. So when we see this movie, it's kind of shocking and revelatory in the way a great biopic should be. That you know maybe this person, so it gets you into the theater, but the process and more about that person, you're surprised that he's at sort of this sort of stoic figure, quiet, but a man that's driven and the sacrifices that come with it. And that's sort of a common theme with Damien Chazelle's movies, is like the cost and the sacrifice of greatness and what the sort of negatives that come along with it, highlighting those as well as the success, but the sort of trade-off that you have to make. And that's the one thing that was interesting to me, that a lot of it is a process movie, that it's about not necessarily Apollo 11, the final mission. It's about everything that comes before it. It's about the trial and error. It's about the intense work. It's about the friends who are constantly having to risk their life, that they're in this sort of community with all the other astronauts, and Neil is just one of the guys that sort of made it, that so many other guys didn't make it, and he has to sort of watch his friends come in and out and risk their lives and die just for the sort of ultimate goal, that there is a lot of sacrifice towards that. So there's sort of like a strong emotional connection there, but it's also a process movie, just seeing how the sort of space programs started, and how Apollo started, and how it finally got to 11, and the progress and all the different time and hard work that needs to get there, and the risk and problems that occurred, that Neil almost died seemingly 100 different times, but finally made it to the moon. And it's a technical marvel all around, whether it be the sort of gritty, rackety 16mm footage of being within the capsule, showing how sort of rackety and rinky-dink some of this stuff was, versus the sort of great grand IMAX sequences on the moon, or also sort of the handheld 35mm sequences at the home, really giving that intimate feel to Armstrong and his family, and grounding us from the sort of family elements to the large, grandness of space, but still grounding that with some of the more familial elements of the movie. The score is terrific. I almost put it on my list of the top 10 scores of the decade, but I went with Justin Hurwitz's La La Land score. It's really just a great process movie about a man driven with a mindset of something larger than his own, and the willpower that it takes to get there, and the sacrifice that it takes to get there. It's a terrific film. It's very well done. Maybe it's not of the heights of something like La La Land, but it's really terrific and really worth your time, and a different sort of look at, Neil Armstrong, but you don't really. So definitely check out First Man. Then the next movie I'm going to be talking about now is Rush. A great racing sports movie about 2 Formula One drivers early on in the sport, James Hunt and Niki Lauda. And this is a movie that is not like some of the others where it's a biopic, but of 2 people that are lesser known, but still lesser known to me. I didn't know anything about them going into the movie, but they're still popular within the sport of Formula One. But also, it's a dual movie. It's about 2 people. That's not really James Hunt with supporting Niki Lauda or vice versa. It really is about these 2 men and their rivalry. It's about how these guys can have these 2 different philosophies and how they sort of clash and their personalities clash, both in the car and on the racetrack and outside. That James Hunt is more of this bravadic, sort of suave kind of a risk taker, that he's able to take the risk that Niki Lauda is not, where Niki is very much interested in doing the hard work, testing, being a little bit more process driven, and figuring out how to get done while playing sort of the perfect race without taking those unnecessary risks as he views them. But as much as is a rivalry, there really is a great amount of respect for each other. That there's moments where they hate each other, but there's also moments where they connect, and the moments with each other, which we do get a lot of, are also really terrific. And I think Ron Howard is able to really connect the movie to the sport. What's so unique about the sport than versus others is that they're just as much as engineers and innovators as they are athletes. That it's constantly about tweaking the car and doing small things and just having the feel and knowing how the car feels while they're going into the races. The race scenes are intense. There's sort of these shaky cameras and intense fast editing, which makes you really feel like you're in the seat of the race car, but also sort of the risk that comes with it because it's still early on in the sport, because they're going so fast, and the safety elements aren't necessarily totally there because they're willing to eliminate safety sometimes for that ultimate speed. So a movie that's interested in the connection between metal and man, and that's unique to the sport, which has these really exhilarating racing sequences, while also still talking about sort of the different personalities and philosophies of men and their strive for winning and excellence, and just having a really entertaining movie about these sort of things, played by really terrific performances. I think Chris Hemsworth's probably best non-Thor performance. Daniel Bruhl as Niki Lauda is also really terrific, and then the two men bounce off each other really nicely. So if you want to see a movie like Rush, which is exciting and very rewatchable, and you haven't yet, definitely check out Rush if what I just said intrigues you, because I think you will definitely appreciate it. Then my final honorable mention is going to be Straight Outta Compton. The box office sensation of 2015, a rousing and exhilarating biopic starring some of the most exciting young actors of the time. This is a story about NWA, the rap group which really just changed the music industry. And I think this movie is interesting, and why this movie succeeds is because of its interest in change. That not only is this a story about these 5 guys who make it big and come from the ghettos and make it into a real sort of big national phenomenon, it's also about the change of music. That this is really the first time we see rap and hip-hop on this national scale being so popular. And really the conflicts and the success that comes with change, that some people are just rabid about, some people love it, but then other people will really sort of be against it. That a lot of people, were throwing their CDs and burning them and protesting because they didn't like the vulgarity of their message, despite other people really sort of responding to that. But then also the personal elements, the relationships, how some people try and manipulate the guys who are trying to get on top and are sort of sworn by so much stuff that they sort of just give away a lot of their control, or even some of the family members that sort of rise from the ghettos that still think that they're related to them in a certain way and try to manipulate them or try to get them back down to their level. Like I said, the whole cast is really terrific. Such ingenious casting things, whether it be something like, O'Shea Jackson Jr., Ice Cube's son playing Ice Cube, a younger version of Ice Cube, which could have been a bad version of just, base casting because he looks like him, but he actually turns out to be one of the best actors in the movie and has gone on to really do great things, whether it be in Long Shot, etc. But the cast overall is really great in their sort of individual parts. And I think the first half is super rousing. It's electric, it's entertaining, and just seeing that rise is so much fun with the charisma that these guys have and the incredible story, like I said, of disrupting the piece, of changing the different sort of change of pace in terms of the newness of rap music and hip hop into the modern popular culture. And then I think the second half sort of falters just because it slows down a little bit more, it gets a little bit lost, it meanders a bit because it's just trying to pack in so much stuff. But the story of NWA, just watching it, is exciting enough, it's interesting enough, and I think if you don't know too much about the story, it's going to be so much fun. It's sort of a great popcorn blockbuster in that sense because of the story is so engaging and exciting, and because these guys give it so much energy and so much youth trying to change the system and change the establishment. It's very interesting. And then I think it's also really great at sort of trying to understand the dynamics of it's not easy just to change something, and there's going to be people that push back and in inner division and things like that sort of allows you to fall. So there's some interesting elements within this movie in terms of just the rise and fall, which you could mirror to sort of Greek tragedy, while also talking about the modern day pop culture being influenced really with the start of NWA. A really fascinating movie and an exciting movie all around. So if you haven't seen Straight Outta Compton, I definitely recommend it to a lot of people, even if you don't like rap or hip hop. It's just a totally really exciting, great movie. Okay, now jumping into the list with my number 10 pick going to be The Fighter.
Okay, I'll see you in Mickey's corner.
This is your time. I had my time, I blew it. You don't have to. You'll make it what? You'll make it what?
An Oscar movie through in and throughout. It's a sort of type of genre that we've seen, I think maybe in a way starting with The Fighter, but definitely more evolved throughout this decade in terms of the Oscar movies. This idea that these actors in a great big ensemble playing real life people in a sort of certain situation. That you're going to have this all-star cast of Hollywood actors playing real life people in this inspiring story. Now, some do it better than others, but I think The Fighter is really the standard and the A class of everything. You've got Christian Bale, Mark Wahlberg, Amy Adams, Melissa Leo. Both Christian Bale and Melissa Leo win the Academy Award for their performances in this movie, and I think Mark got nominated for producer because it got nominated for Best Picture, and then Amy got nominated for Best Supporting Actress. So really terrific sort of acting jobs all around. But if you don't know, the movie is about a boxer from Boston named Mickey Ward and his sort of journey dealing with some personal problems and family issues and his journey to becoming a world boxing champion. And I think the movie sort of nails the seediness part of Boston and the sort of idea of generations being here. That's an old American town, that there's been 5-6 generations of people, the Saudis or in the South who are have just been living there for a long time and then feel like a strong connection to the city of Boston and are not afraid to show that. Of course, you have the terrific and very funny and often sort of overdone, but I think done well here, Boston accent and sort of that typical stereotypical element of being rude and abrasive and sort of the "you're not better than me" energy that so much of Boston movies have. But what I think is good about this movie is that it's not all this sort of character types, that it's not just all these types of Boston stereotypes people, that there is different sort of relationships and different types of people that are all from Boston, but within the movie that have different way they act and different personalities like everyone else. Mark Wahlberg is sort of more quiet and reserved, playing Mickey Ward, where Christian Bale, playing his brother Dickie, is much more eccentric and used to be a boxer, but has sort of fallen on hard times and is dealing with a crack addiction and going from sort of crack houses and being sort of a loose cannon and not being reliable with his brother. So, it's sort of the dynamic, I think, for the most part, is Mickey and dealing with his family. Mickey with his girlfriend, Amy Adams, the support that she gives him, but also him trying to figure out and try to become a great boxer and trying to do great things that way, and the pressure that comes with title fights and everything like that, on top of the sort of personal struggles that he has to deal with. Now, it's a great boxing movie. That as much as it is a movie about family and domesticity, it really is a great boxing movie. And I think a movie like Raging Bull is a good boxing movie, but it's really a movie about Jake LaMotta and a man and his anger, and less so about the actual sport of boxing. But I think The Fighter is able to really understand the sport of boxing and get into that in terms of the mentality of it, in terms of just how it shoots the fights, in terms of the different philosophies. I mean, Dickie used to be a boxer, and his philosophy was always, not getting hit. Where, of course, Mickey is very much sort of a plowing forward, getting hit and taking the punches and rolling with them and keep on going kind of a fighter. So, of course, the boxing is really interesting and great, but it still mirrors the family problems, that the different philosophies between Mickey and Dickie sort of show the different personality types. That Christian Bale is more the eccentric. He is so terrific here, playing, crack addicted. He really, a former boxer, that he is great at becoming this person, really transforming that you don't see Christian Bale anymore. I also think that the movie does a great job at positioning his character in such a unique way. That we've seen so many movies about, he's the loose cannon boxer, yada, 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 or he's the, loose cannon friend and you can't trust him and he's a little bit of a wild card. And that's sort of a trope we've seen in a lot of movies. But a lot of times it's hard to nail because we're just wondering as an audience member, well, why do I like this guy? Why should I even care about this guy? Why is this protagonist friends with this guy? Why am I supposed to care about him? What I think the film does well, and David O. Russell is able to do, is that capture Dickie from Mickey's perspective. That Mickey sees Dickie as his half brother, and still sees him as his brother, as his family, as his trainer. That we see the actions that he does, and he keeps messing up, and he keeps betraying trust. But we what Bale is able to do and Russell's able to communicate by putting it almost through Mickey's perspective is that he still has a good heart, that you still sort of see and understand that he's a guy who wants to help. He's just sort of struggling with this addiction problem, and that he doesn't, that it's part his personality, but part, he's a drug addict and he's struggling with that. And Bale is able to sort of communicate that extra layer within the performance, as well as being sort of bold and eccentric. He's able to communicate that other element that's really necessary to liking this guy and understanding why he's still around and why Mickey keeps on trusting him. But conversely, I think Mark Wahlberg sort of gets overshadowed by the bigness of someone like Christian Bale, but I would argue is just as good. He is someone who is a different kind of a Mark Wahlberg role, because he's more stoic, he's a little bit more quiet and reserved, that he does have some of these more moments of anger and bursting out, but for the most part he's pretty retained and pretty reserved, and is really showing all the weight and the pressure that he has, that not only does he have to deal with trying to fight for the title, he's also dealing with that familial elements, and all that we see through Mark Wahlberg's performance is weighing on him. It's really tough to sort of just get through the day. He almost looks tired or exhausted every time he has to talk, and he's just to this crazy, say, boxing workout, but he has to deal with this family issue, and Melissa Leo, his mother, screaming her head off, and trying to talk to him, and remember where you came from, kind of an attitude, and dealing with that. So for a great family drama that's also a really good boxing movie that nails its setting, that's really sort of a rousing, inspiring story, definitely check out The Fire if you haven't. It's definitely a best version of these Hollywood actors playing these characters, real life people, in an inspiring story, kind of a movie that's kind of maybe Oscar bait, but this one I think is really well deserved and well appreciated, and I had to make the list here at number 10. Then with my 9th pick, I'm going to be talking about The Walk. I've said it on pretty much every list, and I'll say it again. A great list needs to have at least one movie that is completely unique to the list maker. One that is unique to your personal own taste. I could have definitely made a top 10 list that is of all the best Oscar kind of movies that were nominated, that are all critically acclaimed. But that would be a boring list, and also wouldn't be true to the list maker. That these are my lists, and I don't want to make what I would consider even the best, but more along the times is what my favorite type of a movie is, and what my favorite kind of a biopic is. And in this case, it's going to be The Walk, a movie that maybe was positioned for some Oscar love, but didn't get any. I don't think has a great sort of positive reputation or even a cult status. But if there is The Walk cult, I'm a part of it for sure. From legendary director Robert Zemeckis, who is really able to capture all of the entertainment and blockbuster filmmaking he has learned over his years, combined with some of his more modern early 2000s digital filmmaking lessons and CGI motion capture and visual effects he's learned all the way back to, with Roger Rabbit. Combine that all together to create a rousing and really entertaining movie called The Walk. It's about Philippe Petit, a high wire artist who wants to walk on a wire in between the two towers, and that's his goal. And the movie plays like a sort of heist movie. That the first part is a sort of just understanding the man. That so much of the interest about this movie is how is the man himself, Philippe Petit, and his perspective on the world. He sees high wire performing as a sort of art form, that he sees it as sort of his dream and his goal, and he's incredibly passionate, incredibly desirable into getting this final goal, so much so that he's able to convince and persuade so many of these people to help him achieve this and get so many people to work along. So the first part is really understanding Philippe Petit and his mentality. Oh, played beautifully, really, by Joseph Gordon-Levitt. He is over the top. He has this kind of funny French accent, but it works because of these sort of eccentricities of the man himself, that he is sort of like this. And Gordon is able to capture the eccentricities and the passion, the sort of charisma that Petit was able to command to actually do this task, to actually get these people to actually do it. This is communicated through the fictionalized version. And I've seen the documentary with Man on Wire, which I enjoy, but I actually like the movie a little bit better, the fictionalized one, because it's able to sort of go on these incredibly different angles and unique sort of structure to keep things going along. That it's whimsical, that it's fun, and it's definitely fast-paced. It's definitely sort of a great movie magic kind of a movie. But when the first part we're learning more about Philippe Petit and the man himself, soon we realize this is his goal. He wants to walk across on a wire the Twin Towers in New York. Okay, let's do it. And now it's a heist movie, and now it's trying to get all these different guys to help us. Now trying to figure out how do we get the wire from one side to the other side. How do we even get into the tower? It's going under construction. People are working there. There's going to be security. How do you sort of get away with it? Because, of course, it is illegal. All those sort of different elements that you would say figure out how to rob a bank in a general heist movie. This is trying to pull off a heist, trying to pull off just this incredible task and break the law and talk to people and really gather together a team to get this done. Then once we get to the final sequence, I've seen the documentary, I know how it plays out, but when I saw the final sequence, it was incredibly tense, incredibly sort of jaw-dropping, and I didn't even see it in the theater, I just saw it on my TV, but I still think it holds up. We have this incredible sort of sequences where we see him just stepping out on the ledge, the sort of overhead shots of how far it is down below, the sort of coldness that you feel with it being up there, the beautiful shots of it being in the clouds and seeing it. It's really a breathtaking movie, and it's incredibly emotionally moving that just this small act that we've been waiting to finally see, and you see it happen, it is terrific and incredibly moving. That it's going to happen, but you just want to see it happen anyways. You just want to see how it happened, how he actually was able to do that. So with Philippe Petit being such a fascinating and interesting man, played Joseph Gordon-Levitt, I think, he's able to capture that and does it very well. Is able to propel the story. Then we have the heist movie, so everything's, the movie never lets you stop and breathe for a second. It's always keep on going and going and going and keeping your interest. So then we get the heist, and then we get the final sequence, which is just really breathtaking and awe-inspiring, and just a great visual exercise of how the climax of the movie doesn't necessarily have to be with a big speech or big words or a big action necessarily. It's just this one act and the image of that, and that the image itself can be this overwhelmingly powerful thing, and how it's shot is breathtaking in and of itself. It's delightful, it's charming, it's moving. I love Joseph Gordon-Levitt in it. I think it's, filmmaking that I adore, this idea of movie magic, this blockbuster kind of element. That's a lane of movie making that guys like Zemeckis and Spielberg and J.J. Abrams do so terrific, and I think The Walk was sort of dismissed for being that, despite it being incredibly rousing and moving biopic. So, well, it's not a movie that I think a lot of people look back maybe fondly upon, or maybe they enjoyed it but haven't thought much about it since. The Walk is a movie that I really connected with, and really I was interested in the pursuit and the fascination of a man like Philippe Petit, and how Joseph Gordon-Levitt really portrayed him, and then how Zemeckis sort of combined all these pieces together to make a really entertaining, rousing film. I was smiling, grinning from ear to ear the whole time. So if you maybe missed The Walk because of mixed reviews, definitely check it out, because I think it's totally worth your time. Then my 8th pick, and the movie I'm going to talk about at number 8, is going to be Darkest Hour.
We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. For without victory, there can be no survival.
Another movie, while appreciated by the Oscars, maybe has a negative perception, but one that definitely connected with me, and one that, like The Walk, I have seen multiple times. Silly and grand in all the best ways possible, but one of the most fascinating and eccentric politicians of the 20th century, of course, being Winston Churchill. Now, biopics don't always have to be these sort of from life to death and sort of the whole encapsulation of one's entire life, because so many times when movies try to do a whole life movie, they just miss out on a lot of the details that make the person who they are. and can't do that much really within 2 hours. So it's often better to do a biopic format and structure by allowing you to do just a small window of their life to explain how they are in real life, or how they were if they passed away. In this case, it's about this sort of few-year period where Winston Churchill becomes the Prime Minister of England and has to fight against England during World War II. Has to fight against, Hitler during World War II. It's a movie that could be sort of seen as a stuffy British period piece that's Oscar bait that I think so many people think or sort of lump it into, but I think it's much weirder and eccentric with that, and I think it has to do with the man himself, Winston Churchill, played of course brilliantly by Gary Oldman. And you could say, oh yeah, Gary Oldman was going to win, oh it's just an example of the Oscars, you put on makeup and you uglify yourself a bit and you win the Oscar, and then, you know, it's not necessarily the best acting but best impersonation. That because of recent years, so many of the best Oscar winners just put on sort of makeup and win the best Oscar. I think people have a bad stigma towards that. But I think in this case, it's ill-fitted and wrong, because Gary Oldman really does give a terrific performance in this. He's able to act through the makeup, and that's almost denying the fact that Gary Oldman has always been doing this. He's been transforming with or without the makeup, with and something like Dracula, or without something like Commissioner Gordon is totally different from Sid Vicious. They're two different people, and Gary Oldman's always been an actor to be able to transform, and is terrific in this as Winston Churchill. Now, there's a certain type of biopic where you'll like just because you like the person. For example, if you're a big fan of Freddie Mercury, you'll probably really like Bohemian Rhapsody just because you like Freddie Mercury a lot. You want to see him and his story. Well, I'm a big fan of Winston Churchill. I'm a big fan of this period of World War II. So going into it, I was interested just on that fact. And when I rewatched the movie, and when I sort of seek out this movie, I'm always seeking it out because not only do I think it is a well-delivered movie and well-executed movie, I also like Winston Churchill, so I have a personal preference towards that. But Oldman really is terrific in the movie and is really able to capture the balance that exists within Winston Churchill. That in one part he is heroic and intense, but other part he is sort of charismatic and eccentric and weird. A lot of this is expressed through some of the lines. He could have an intense screaming match where he says, you can't reason with a tiger when your head is in his mouth. And these sort of great screaming lines that I like to sort of say back are fun to say. These great sort of screenwriting dialogue lines that are delivered brilliantly by Gary Oldman. But then you have other, so that line gives a sort of heroism. But then you have these other lines that show the sort of funniness, stop interrupting me while I'm interrupting you. These little sort of smart little one-liners that Gary Oldman is really able to put through, and that's why I say it's almost a little bit silly of a movie, because of the sort of grandness that is just fun to scream out these lines, because of the heightenedness that is rightfully deserved, because this is an intense, crazy time of the 20th century, really, but also it works because of Gary Oldman's delivery, and I think it makes sense, like I said, because of the period, but also that's the element that I like about it, the sort of elevated, heightened element of the movie. The cinematography by Bruno Del Bonell is fantastic, whether it's just the golds of his chambers to the sort of the drenched red photography within the war room and the intense amount of stress that we really feel. Oh, these aren't the guys who are down in the mud shooting people, but they're the guys responsible for their lives. They're the guys telling them where to go and being the strategists and taking on that sort of weight and having the country really in their hands and how to proceed. And the sort of debates and the political elements and the machinations that are going on there are really interesting to see, because of how Churchill is such this unique kind of a bulldog energy of a politician, and a different kind of a politician. He's frank, he's honest, he tells it like it is, but he's not playing this sort of politician's kind of a game. So for a movie about a subject figure, Winston Churchill, that I already was interested in, delivered, I think, and executed really well. Not as stuffy and British period piece as maybe you think. Check it out again if you have that sort of opinion. It's weirder than I think maybe you initially imagined, just because Winston Churchill is such an odd guy. So for me, that's why I ultimately had to put it on the list. Then the final movie I'm going to be talking about today is going to be Ford v Ferrari.
Give me one reason why I don't fire everyone starting with you.
Well, sir, the
lighter, we're faster. When that don't work, we're nastier.
Go ahead, Carol. Go to war. You got a plan?
It's high risk.
I thought the whole point was to win the damned race.
A classic Hollywood movie from last year that managed to be a total success. A $100 million movie for adults with 2 movie stars is something that frankly is rarely seen nowadays, but would have been a huge success back in the day. Ford v Ferrari is a movie that's been bouncing around and gone from director to director throughout Hollywood for these years, but finally it lands in James Mangold's lap, and he really delivers a terrific movie that is just a great movie all around. It won, of course, 2 Oscars. It made a bunch of money at the box office. And it's a great movie that I think I'd recommend to a lot of people. Now, it, at the time, was sort of talked about and pigeonholed into sort of an old-fashioned dad movie. But if that's the kind of movie it is, well, those are the kind of movies I like, I guess. But I think that's almost a little bit reductive because they're saying it's for one type of person, but I do actually think it is for a lot of different type of people. That it's old-fashioned, but that's not necessarily, in my opinion, a negative. That it follows a sort of maybe formula and formulaic kind of a storytelling, but also that's really hard to do. That a lot of people think, oh, it's easy just to follow the formula and put in A, B, and C, and it comes out a great movie. But actually, it's really hard to do. That it's simple, but it's also modern. That there's a lot going on here that makes it feel like an old-fashioned movie, but doesn't make it feel like an old movie. The story is about the companies Ford and Ferrari, where the Ford Motor Company wants to start and join into the racing business and beat Ferrari at the Le Mans 24-hour race. So they get the only American to ever win the race, Carroll Shelby, to get together a team and build a car that can beat Ferrari at Le Mans. And with the help of race car driver Ken Miles, they set out to do the impossible. So Matt Damon, this is really a two-hander. Matt Damon playing Carroll Shelby and Christian Bale playing Ken Miles. And it's really about these two men. That there is, of course, Lee Iacocca and Henry Ford II. But for the most part, it's a biopic. It's a story about these two men and their sort of singular pursuit for Ford beat Ferrari and do something great within the American racing industry. They both have movie star energy and exude charisma, and there's not really, this is Christian Bale's movie and Matt Damon is a supporting actor. I really do think it's a two-hander throughout the movie. And there's not a sort of rivalry like something like Rush, that there is, for the most part, a teamwork element, that it's both of them working for Ford, but oftentimes it's them against the man of Ford. It's them trying to go back against the sort of corporate elements that Ford tries to implement on them. And I think that sort of like a good rom-com, the chemistry between the two leads really work here in this scenario, and Matt Damon and Christian Bale are just total consummate professionals and have that movie star element, and them together is just so much fun. Hating each other, loving each other, and sort of going back and forth. That bromance is strong here, and the amount of respect that they have for each other is clearly demonstrated. But like I was saying before, it's an old-fashioned movie, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. And I think that the idea that people think it's old-fashioned, but ultimately still like the movie, is a testament to how un-old-fashioned it is. That it's, old, for the most part, old movies have longer takes, that they have these sort of moving cameras, that they allow these scenes to breathe a little bit more, versus modern movies are more interested in speed and try to keep the viewer engaged. And Netflix movies, you don't want to look at your phone at all, so there's always this rapid sort of cutting pace to the movies. But here, it still feels like a modern movie. It still feels like a movie that came out in 2019, that it's a great period detail, and the cinematography by Fina Papamakau is terrific. And as much as there's sort of long takes and scenes, it doesn't necessarily feel old-fashioned and bad. It doesn't feel like it's an old movie, or it doesn't feel unentertaining. That it's slow in some of the elements and takes its time, but the camera still moves and the shots are being reframed, and feels appropriate to the story. The same thing with the racing scenes. Something like Rush has a lot of this sort of fast pace, make you feel like you're in the race car race scenes. But you lose a little bit of the context that you do gain in Ford v Ferrari. That the racing scenes are exciting, but it's a balance. It's a balance of taking your time and understanding that the physical geography of the space, and that requires long takes, and it requires not cutting a lot to make things clear to the audience, where you see Christian Bale and then you see the race car driver and you see where they are in terms of their place in the race. So we have that element, but also it still cuts enough and cuts in the more intense moments rapidly so that it's able to feel like an intense movie. And it won for best editing at the Oscars, and I think rightfully so, because it really balances that element of an entertaining story while still feeling modern, while still being labeled as old-fashioned, because it doesn't edit all this much, but still feels modern, still keeps you interested in the movie. So even if you're not into cars, I think you'll enjoy the sort of process movie of tinkering and getting better and trying to beat the odds and that sort of underdog mentality with these great performances with Matt Damon and Christian Bale. But also a movie that's entertaining, that feels like maybe an old movie, but is secretly more modern than you think, and that finding that right balance is so hard to do that people think it's easy because it's a formula, but really it's difficult and really well executed, that I was really amazed by how well Ford v Ferrari really did it. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know some of your favorite biopics of the decade. Of course, stay tuned to next week where I give my picks from 6 to 2. And once again, the timestamps are in the description, so if you want to hear about movies and jump around, you can do that as well at your convenience. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a video. That's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.